Hi, good evening, guys. Sorry for the delay for today's segment. We had a few interesting queries about the last segment that came through last minute. I'm Justin McGuire for those of you who had not attended the previous webinar segments, and this webinar series is to afford the understanding of what Th2 immunological dominance is, what it does, and the solutions that can afford to our capacity to revert our immune systems into a neutral, healthy, responsive state rather than that of a highly reactive state. So just to recap, in our initial segment, we went over the differences between the different arms of the immune system, or the different main categories of the immune system, that of the innate and adaptive immune system. Thereafter, we went into what Th2 immune responses actually are, and these are warranted responses, not necessarily aberrant responses. Then we went into variables that cause a dominance of Th2 immunological activity. Then we went into variables of what this actually does, this heightened Th2 dominance actually does to the mitochondria. And subsequently, we went into greater detail as to what the cell danger 1 response state, the concept of the cell danger response concept coined by Professor Robert Navio, and how Th2 dominance actually has an association to this particular theory in potentiating a CDR1 hyper-responsive or ongoing responsive state, and the potentials that that can induce from different varying pathology to symptomology that a person can experience behind that. So today we're going to expand upon what we had briefly mentioned in our previous segment, and that is the impact that Th2 dominance has on the microvasculature by way and how histamine increases fibrin release and fibrin deposits, creating a fibrotic microvasculature, subsequently impacting the potential of cellular thyroid activity on the mitochondrial level, thus leading to the potential outcome of hyperthyroid-like symptoms, albeit that potential lab values do not indicate hyperthyroid outcomes. In instances as which T3, T4, TSH, reverse T3 may not necessarily suggest that one ought to be experiencing those symptoms, yet the person nonetheless is. One of the variables to that is the immunological disruption to the receipt of the signal of thyroid hormone, or at least the disruption to the efficient receipt of that particular signal. To that point, it's actually not necessarily to our own detriment as to why this happens. The body is rather intelligent in preventing itself from being overstimulated in a scenario whereby there is an excess of inflammation and heat. And in particular instances when we have exacerbated histamine released, causing permeability issues of membrane, leading to quote unquote leakiness or inflammation in the body, it would be justifiable as how and why the immune system would cause or a reduction in the endocrine system's capacity to facilitate more energy production and release, as in how thyroid does so by improving upon oxidative phosphorylation by stimulating uncoupling protein 3, specifically in the oxidative phosphorylated pathways. So with that being said, we actually now are going to be considering ways on how one can overcome the ongoing cellular hyperthyroid effect that Th2 dominance induces. But before we do that, I just want to emphasize that it's first and foremost important to first identify what are the variables that are actually leading or contributing towards this Th2 immunological dominant state. As we did mention in previous segments, certain variables such as environmental toxins, biotoxins, DAMPs, and PAMPs variables, all of which could be causing a distorted immunological vigilance, leading to this hyperhistamine Th2 polymorphonuclear leukocyte activity, of which we need to identify, neutralize, remove in certain instances, and reestablish equilibrium. It is vitally important to consider doing so prior to trying to ramp up metabolic output by way of enhancing thyroid activity, as in if one does not readily go about identifying and modulating the causative effects of Th2 dominance and amplifies thyroid activity, thyroid in and of itself is a stimulant to mast cell activities, which can, in this instance, further potentiate a worsened histamine response or reactive outcome, leading to a further exacerbated Th2, dare I say, even leading into Th17 immunological dominant states associated to autoimmunity. So the moral of all this is first look into ways in which you can neutralize the threat, removing variables that are causing a perception of threat, modulate the outcomes that that threat has created to or modulate the outcomes of distortion that that threat has created to the immune system, and then at that point optimize the metabolic throughput within which the system can have a systems-wide reboot and recovery, taking the cell danger response through its subsequent phases into the point at which we have CDR0 or a well-balanced respiratory chain efficacies from anaerobic glycolysis to tricarbolic acid activity and into eventual electron transport chain balanced electron shuttling through the proton pump gradient. So that's what this segment is about when we get to that point, once we have addressed the variables of immunological disruption, issuing the Th2, how can we further improve upon the restoration of metabolism from a metabolomic perspective? And this is where we are going to dive in to certain variables around the mitochondrial thyroid axis. So that being said, I will be sharing my screen shortly, and let's get going. Right. So Th2 dominant solutions here. This is our sixth segment, solutions to improve mitochondrial thyroid receptivity. Okay, so first couple of things here, just to consider what does the actual mitochondria require, what does the thyroid require, and what do they both need in order to improve upon metabolomic efficacy and outcome. Firstly, to optimize thyroid hormone levels, we need to understand as to what's causing it. Is it a pituitary issue? Is it a substrate deficiency? Is it an excess of cortisol? In instances of excess cortisol, as an example, this can lead to a rise of reverse T3 deiodinase activity taking preference to the production of reverse T3 as opposed to free T3 as a means of a failsafe to reduce excessive metabolism in an instance where there is hypercortisol release occurring. Other instances which also have associated to an excess of stress response, either through cortisol or catecholamine, an increase of free radicals is often seen in those outcomes, which leads to deficiencies of certain minerals such as selenium. Selenium, which is vitally important for the conversion of T4 into T3, as well as being a very important precursor to selenmethionine, which is highly potent antioxidant outcomes. To that other point, lack of iodine, which is becoming more and more prevalent in our day and age, due to often, this is also a reason as to why table salt has been iodized, as in the 70s and late 60s, there was an increased rise of thyroid-related poor childhood neurological development, of which they discovered actually had a lot to do with insufficient iodine intake. Hence the reason why a lot of our commercial table salt has been iodized. To the point, so we got to consider how do we optimize thyroid hormone levels. Before we can consider how to optimize them, we need to consider what is that's actually causing deficiency in either production or conversion into a state that may be causing inhibition rather than facilitation of metabolomic output. So again here, it's used to T3 containing therapies for improved mitochondrial activation over T4 monotherapy. So these are instances whereby the naturopathic route hasn't seen the restorative effect that one would hope for. Always try to look for the least invasive processes in order to do so. Nutraceuticals, cortisol adaptogens modulation, identify whether or not there are bacterial variables such as H. pylori that could be disrupting thyroid by inducing an antibody or autoantibody response to the thyroid, which H. pylori has been seen to be able to do. So figure out what's going in the terrain, and first and foremost, try to remove variables in the terrain that are causing distortion. However, In doing so, even in the, as I mentioned, certain levels, blood levels of hormones may be seen as optimal or efficient, yet there's still underlying symptoms of akin to deficiency. In these instances, certain considerations should be given in ways in which to proliferate the quantity of receptor availability in order to gain a thyroid active response. And one way in which to do so under the due care of a medical professional is to increase a supraphysiological state of thyroid activity in which the body would compensate by producing more receptors to be able to uptake the surplus of hormone being made available. However, this does come with intense caution, as in an excess of thyroid can also lead to variables such as excess of bone turnover, calcium deposits in the cardiocytes, amongst many other variables. So it does work. It does have its place. However, it does require ongoing monitoring of blood chemistry in order to validate that the therapy is not causing harm, but it's actually causing support in the recovery of the mitochondria and the entire mitochondrial thyroid axis. Other variables reduce oxidative stress, and this is a somewhat of a paradoxical point because it is important for us to remember that the thyroid both potentiates the outcome of oxidation, hence the reason how it helps to produce ATP, but T3 is also a very powerful antioxidant in many instances as well. So when it is that we're looking to reduce oxidative stress, we also do not want to excessively do so to the point in which we suppress the oxidative phosphorylated purpose or process in the production of ATP. So oxidation is required for the electron shuttle to have efficiency in ATP production. But when it comes to the containment of that electron transfer, this is where we consider variables such as intracellular copper stores and whether or not they are efficient to support cytochrome C reductase, as an example, and thus reducing the premature release of cytochrome C, which is a highly oxidative variable. So it's more about looking into the mechanisms as to how they feed into or do not effectively feed into one another, rather than just simply saying, okay, let's add in some glutathione. Not to say that that's a wrong way to go. Glutathione can have its place, particularly when the underlying mechanisms are still a requirement of replenishment. And due to that fact, sulfur metabolism often can become compromised, especially when molybdenum and iron utility are altered in states of copper insufficiency or intracellular copper insufficiency. In those instances, glutathione certainly can serve purpose as a stabilizing component in an erratic gradient. But then again, also, for example, the utilization of a precursor to the production of glutathione, such as NAC. NAC plays other role as well by helping to break up disulfide bonds, thus degrading biofilm, as well as aiding the degradation of variables such as spike protein. However, it's also important to remember that NAC also increases the sequestration of intracellular copper stores to promote heightened neutrophil activity. So in certain individuals, especially those who have low red blood cell copper counts, NAC may be somewhat counterproductive in the support of a highly oxidative state. In those instances, glutathione may be a better route or better option to select and supporting the requirements of reduction in a highly free radical state. But it's really important to consider that inflammation doesn't necessarily mean a high effective degree of oxidation. It actually can mean poor ineffective oxidation, leading to premature loss of hydrogen ions, leading to increase of inflammatory reactants. So that does lead into a question of how it is that we can improve upon the stability of the electron shift, whilst reducing the leakage in that process, which comes into, again, the available substrates, especially considering how NAD is recycled and utilized, preventing its likelihood of being cannibalized by other immune cells, such as the use of 5-amino 1-MQ or resveratrol, both of which support the recycling as well as preservation and reduction of of immune cells cannibalizing NAD, which is vitally important because the output of oxidative phosphorylation is an increased yield of NAD, in which if there is a premature leak in that whole oxidative process, that NAD can most certainly induce an immunological and inflammatory reactive outcome. So we really want to prevent that from happening as best as we can by seeing or noting on organic acids urinalysis as an example. What are the variables that are lacking in the process of respiratory chain efficiency, from that of anaerobic glycolysis to the tricarbolic acid cycle to the eventual electron transport chain? To that point, promote endogenous antioxidant systems through dietary phenols and superoxide dismutase cofactors. That's very important, even when it comes to dietary phenols, to consider the load of certain hormones and also the availability of certain microbiome. Certain microbiome profile may not afford the effective balance of commensal bacteria to be able to help degrade phenols. And the consumption of polyphenols in these instances may actually potentiate more histamine release, not actually reducing well, in doing so, paradoxically actually heightening the free radical effect, not reducing it. Also important to remember that phenols are also stimulatory to the nervous system. They can be positively stimulatory to the nervous system, but it is contextual, as in the environment of methyl donors, methyl availability to enzymes that are required in order to break down phenols, as well as the environment which supports the production of those enzymes. So the point to make here is take a look into organic acids and stool analyses to determine whether or not polyphenols are the right way to go in order to support NRF2 expression, which they can do in instances when the microbiome profile supports their incorporation. Support mitochondrial biogenesis, CoQ10, PQQ, resveratrol. Again, these substances, ubiquinol, for example, I really truly appreciate the use of ubiquinol to stabilize mitochondrial membrane activity. But in certain instances where there is a compromise in iron sulfur cluster activity, ubiquinol can actually create a worsened effect in that iron sulfur cluster utility of oxidative OXPHOS2 and OXPHOS3 outcomes. So it's really important to take note of how well the body is able to utilize iron and copper. As an example, in a certain scenario whereby bacteria might be kind of feeding off of iron stores, adding in certain mitochondrial biogenetic cofactors like ubiquinol, CoQ10 may actually prove to be premature, and in their premature may heighten more inflammation rather than actually supporting mitochondrial regeneration. Engage regular moderate exercise to enhance mitochondrial turnover and thyroid hormone sensitivity. Again, it depends upon the person's hormetic bandwidth and stress tolerance and the allostatic load that the person is under. The allostatic load has a lot to do with the environmental variables of stress or ongoing stressors that have an impact onto the degree of homeostatic or the capability of homeostatic adaptation and thus hormetic bandwidth. So when there's an ongoing allostatic stressor in the background, the requirement or the suggestion of regular moderate exercise may be inappropriate, because essentially exercise is a stressor, a healthy stressor in the context of a biological environmental construct that can actually receive that stressor for the point of recovery and regeneration. However, if it is that the body is burdened by a high degree of biotoxins or damps, or the outcome that those biotoxins may induce by heightening output of damps, such as the release of cardiolipin as an example, regular moderate exercise can actually worsen the inflammatory state and further compounding that allostatic load to a worsened homeostatic output. And to this last point here, improve cellular energy metabolism. Carnitine can help with beta oxidative processes. Again, carnitine also requires consideration around the thyroidoxin system and how effective it is in the process of glutathione recycling, but also NAD recycling and the process that NAD has universally in full purine synthesis. So it's important to consider, although all these supplements here can help and considerations can help, it's the context that I'm trying to get at that is important in their implementation. It's not a one size fit all that everybody should be taking carnitine or everybody should take CoQ10 or everybody should take glutathione. Quite on the contrary, it's contextual. In certain instances, those exact seemingly healthy, innocent nutraceuticals can actually cause more harm, particularly if introduced in the wrong time frame of the healing journey. However, carnitine can, by the way in which it helps to improve beta oxidation, can support pyruvate dehydrogenase activity alongside its use of thiamine to improve ATP production. Continuing on with solutions to improve mitochondrial thyroid receptor receptivity, address chronic inflammation. I think this is more important than providing the previous nutraceuticals to amplify mitochondrial biogenesis or activity of respiratory chain systems. Now, it's also very important to contextually consider, for example, omega-3 fatty acids. In a state of heightened lipid peroxidation, omega-3 fatty acids could actually worsen the outcome of that, as they are more vulnerable to oxidative stress. Curcumin, yet another, also phenol as well, in context in the scenario where phenol metabolism is compromised due to, as an example, insufficient COMT activity or acetylmethionine availability. This can also lead to a heightened excitatory response in the nervous system. What's better to consider are the actual metabolites from these particular agents. So, for example, utilizing resolvins, pro-resolving mediators from omega-3s rather than direct omega-3s, which have a less of a susceptibility to oxidative outcome as in what full omega-3 fatty acids may have. Or when it comes to the use of curcumin, in instances where phenol metabolism is a problem, to first look into ways in which to improve upon the microbiome's capacity through supplementation of bifidobacteria probiotic, as an example, to warrant the body's capacity to utilize curcumin effectively for anti-inflammatory measures and outcomes. However, in the wrong instance, curcumin, paradoxically again, can actually induce an inflammatory response if it cannot be metabolized effectively by way and how it can create a stress response to the nervous system in poor instances of poor phenol metabolism. However, if it is that a person can tolerate curcumin, it does have effective microbiome to support phenol degradation, or in instances may require an enzyme such as those produced by Houston enzymes called no-phenol. This most certainly can help to restore the balance between Th1 and Th2 outcomes. But most notably, out of all the nutrients, it's vitamin D that actually modulates the immune system's Th1, Th2 response mostly out of all of our micronutrients. However, it also is dependent upon the vitamin D receptor's activity. In instances of vitamin D receptor resistance, which can manifest due to ongoing inflammatory or autoinflammatory load by dysregulated innate immunity brought on by Th2 immunological dominance. In instances such as these, if one were not to focus on improving upon the receptor's capacity to receive the signal of vitamin D, the vitamin D in question can actually further heighten lipid peroxidative outcomes and create membrane instability. So it is really important in that instance to look into your vitamin D2 to vitamin D3 ratio, or 1:5 to 2:5 ratios, to see exactly where the body is in its own capacity, not obviously having supplements with vitamin D when reviewing these markers, but rather in a innate status of vitamin D to see how effective the body is in being able to convert vitamin D from a D2 to D3 state. And if there is a lack in the efficiency of conversion, then there's a high probability of vitamin D receptor resistance that may be expressed due to heightened ongoing inflammation the body has been under. Um, Enhanced thyroid hormone conversion, a supplement with selenium and iodine to support T4 to T3 conversion and prevent thyroid hormone insufficiency. That's one variable. Again, it also does require, for example, the heightened use of iodine does come with considerations into how it can also deplete other mineral factors or drive the reduced efficiency of mineral transport, such as calcium. High quantities of iodine can impact parathyroid activity. And that's another consideration to take when one is that one is taking the nutraceutical approach in order to rectify thyroid production and conversion. Addressing gut health, very important here to support the ionized activity and thyroid hormone metabolism. So instead of trying to plug a hole in a ship, what one would rather want to do is figure out where it is that the whole of, in this analogy, the whole of the ship is weak, creating the holes in the first place. And that, in my opinion, is first and foremost looking into the microbiome terrain, determining whether or not only from a microorganism perspective, but also from an environmental toxin perspective, what may be contributing towards the holes in the first place, and putting energy and effort into the removal of variables that ought not to be into the body, whilst also focusing on the re-inoculative processes that should take place in the right order of precedence at the right timing, which is dependent upon both the lived experience of symptomology reporting as well as diagnostic outcomes in the treatment of these type of cases. Third point here, restore cortisol balance, address adrenal dysfunction with adaptogens. Be very cautious, obviously, in the use of ashwagandha, where it's sourced from. Poorly sourced ashwagandha can actually paradoxically also contain a high degree of heavy metals. Also, an excess of ashwagandha can also lead to a heightened drive of androgen signaling, which could be warranted in certain instances. However, if that androgen signaling is balanced with the right progesterone availability, for example, in females, ashwagandha may actually cause excitation rather than modulate stress to a healthy degree. So it can actually do the opposite of what we're wanting it to do, especially in females that have insufficient progesterone to support testosterone and estrogen drive. Rhodiola, great for dopamine regulation. However, its excess in instances of those who have poor D2 receptor activity, D2 receptor activity, which is also largely regulated by a hormone such as progesterone, such as DHT, can actually lead to an exacerbated D1 dopamine-related dominant outcome, which can also lead to its own potential form of dopamine quino. So again, although they are seemingly innocent, if utilized in the wrong endocrine state, these particular adaptogens can lead to harm. So it's really important to take into context how it is that a person responds. One need not test for everything unless you are a certain biohacking celebrity that spends millions a year. I won't mention any names, but not all of us can afford to spend $1 million or $10 million a year on testing. So testing is important, but symptom reporting is also very highly important. It doesn't cost as much money. It actually just costs the process of effort and also a keen ear to hear what's going on. And that is very important to also empower oneself, not just those of practitioners, but those of patients as well, to understand that if you are having a responsive aggression taking ashwagandha, that ought not to be happening, and what could be instigating the opposite effect that particular adaptation is meant to mediate. And through that, one gets to understand their bodies better and understand where there could be deficiency leading to aberrant expression of nutraceutical or hormonal or any interventive effort for that matter. More importantly, apart from just putting a substance into the body, I think we should, as adults, we're looking into ways in which to regulate ourselves. It's not just about what we can buy from a health food shop, but it's also about what strategies we can put into our lifestyle in order to afford a greater hormetic bandwidth, the capacity to tolerate stress. And this is very individual it's very individualized. As an example, I'm not a big fan of yoga. I've tried it, it doesn't work as well for me, but I love meditation. I enjoy going on hikes in nature. Yet other people may not enjoy that. They prefer yoga. So it's really important to figure out what works for you. And sometimes also silent meditation doesn't always gel with me. Sometimes I need a guided meditation. So figure out what works for you and stick to that. But it does require active participation in the discovery process to determine like what foods help to calm you down. Certain foods rev me up. For example, I love Indian food. Has so much phenols in Indian food, and in that, it's really something I wouldn't eat in the evening hours. I'd rather have it for lunchtime, but it can most certainly give me that extra bit of oomph that I need. But specifically cognitively to get through highly cognitive processes in my workday. But I figured that out. If I were to have that same meal in the evening, it delays my capacity to get a good night's sleep. So even food sources can really either rev the body or calm the body. In contrast to that, in my personal experience, butternut soup, as an example, really it gives me such a calming sensation after consuming it, or fish as opposed to a steak as far more calming in the evening hours for me, at least. And that's what it's important that we can all stipulate, okay, there's a different concentration of amino acids and there's a different concentration of minerals, and so on to indicate the probability of why this happens. But I think lived experience is so important because, albeit that science may indicate certain variables of probability, it's never a certainty. Science is always the greatest verisimilitude of outcome, not the certainty of outcome. And this is something I think we've forgotten as a society, that we see science as almost a religion, which it is absolutely not. Science is the verisimilitude of probability, which is most truth likeness, but it is most certainly not the gospel of certainty. And that's something to take into account when you're trying to figure out what works for you. Yes, consider the science, but make sure not to have it be the gospel to your application. Always consider your lived experience as a variable amongst a big paradigm of health in this particular subject of mitochondrial thyroid receptor activity and how it relates to autonomic nervous system tone. Reestablish membrane fluidity. Fatty acids, essential fatty acids, they can help with that. Again, just be contextual in their use. Often in states of mitochondrial thyroid receptivity, thyroid resistance, there is a heightened amount of free radicals due to insufficient electron transport chain efficiency. And in those instances, I wouldn't recommend direct omega-3s, but rather the metabolites of omega-3s, like pro-resolved mediators, as an example. But they most certainly can help alongside the use of certain targeted phospholipids, which work really well. Mitigate autoimmunity, so screen for and address autoimmune thyroid conditions. Interestingly, just to reiterate, Hashimoto's has had a close correlation to H. pylori infection. So if it is that you are seeing an elevation of thyroid antibodies, please do look into a stool test. It may not be H. pylori, but there's no harm in determining if it is, because if it is, and its eradication can lead to normalization of the thyroid, as opposed to going down the rabbit hole of seeing a rheumatologist and everything that comes with. I think it's an easy win. So a bit of consideration for those who have been given recent positive or autoimmune antibody indication of Hashimoto's. Look into whether or not H. pylori could be a variable. in any instance of, in my opinion, and again, it's not gospel, it's scientific. In any instance of somebody struggling with mitochondrial thyroid receptivity and symptoms akin to hypothyroidism, I would really advise, to steer clear of gluten. Often the way in which the body breaks down the proteins from an immunological perspective, gluten-based proteins, the same antibodies that are produced can actually attack the thyroid in and of itself. So really, if it is that you are having hypothyroid symptoms, it's best just to go gluten-free. Anti-inflammatory diet, that's also contextual. As I mentioned, phenols, for example, or polyphenols are seen in anti-inflammatory diets. The Mediterranean diet is probably the most well-known anti-inflammatory diet. Yet in context, phenols can be quite inflammatory. So it's really important to consider what an anti-inflammatory diet means in context of the individual in question. Incorporate proteolytic enzymes. So this is really important, and I touched upon this in our last segment. Proteolytic enzymes, nattokinase, bromylase, serrapeptidase, these are the most probably more well-known. Lumbrokinase is also really good for those who have a plaque buildup in the arterial tract. Neogenesis Health, by the way, probably make the best lumbrokinase I've ever used. So a bit of a calling card there for anybody looking for a good lumbrokinase. Look into Neogenesis Nutraceuticals here in South Africa. Very good company indeed. Yet there's so many different proteolytic blends. However, what their purpose is to help break down the biofilm deposits as well as break down fibrin deposits, and in so doing, improving upon microvasculature circulation, and thus, in theory, and this is all theoretical, to improve upon how well the mitochondria can receive thyroid hormone in question. Unfortunately, this is mostly a retrospective analyses that come into determining the probability or in vitro studies. But there hasn't been any any RCTs that I've seen that actually prove that concept. But nonetheless, it is a concept to consider from a pathophysiological perspective in noting that it's sensical probability, but it's not certainty. So, however, that being said, in practice, I can attest to patients having improved upon the reduction of hypothyroid-like symptoms in the use of proteolytic enzymes, albeit that it wasn't that they were only using proteolytic enzymes, but they were incorporating that in a more complex intervention protocol. However, from a theoretical perspective, it's meant to reduce the fibrin-induced microvascular blockage. Fibrin deposits can obstruct microcirculation, impairing oxygen and nutrient delivery to tissues. Proteolytic enzymes enzymically degrade fibrin clots, improving blood flow and oxygenation. Improved thyroid hormone, which should result theoretically in improved thyroid hormone delivery. Enhanced blood flow ensures better delivery of T3 to target tissues and cells, optimizing its availability for mitochondrial uptake. Again, this is all theoretical. Solutions to improve mitochondrial receptor activity to continue restoration of cell surface receptor function by reducing, this continuing on from the proteolytic enzyme equation. Just to add a bit more thought or consideration for thought here, what I have found that does most certainly have a pronounced effect in reducing as a fibrolytic agent in the body, and this is actually has more scientific merit and study validation, is a compound called pentose polysulfate. So definitely not dismissing the probability of proteolytic enzymes. They most certainly have shown effect from a practical perspective, but from a scientific hierarchy of evidence perspective, what I've come to understand is pentose polysulfate has a greater probability as a fibrolytic agent to actually support the outcomes in this particular pathophysiological situation. Now we're going into DHEA and natural killer cell cytotoxicity. So essentially, when we improve upon natural killer cell cytotoxicity, this can mediate dysregulated neutrophil activity. It doesn't mean that there isn't neutrophil activity in cytotoxic natural killer cell activity. It often happens in concert. However, when we have insufficient natural killer cell activity to neutralize what the body is undertaking or is under threat of, often there can be an exacerbated neutrophil outcome, and of which in the last segment I explained can lead to neutrophil extracellular traps, which can lead to an ongoing inflammatory burden by way in what is contained in those neutrophil extracellular traps. So DHEA actually enhances natural killer cell activity. The mechanism as to how it does so, it is a neuroandrogen steroid or protective steroid hormone. Protects the immune system by enhancing interleukin 12 production. It also needs a bit of consideration in Th1 dominant immunological subtypes. So it is very important that if one is going to consider supraphysiological dosing, at least of DHEA, which in my opinion is anything above 50 milligram, one really ought to do a lymphocyte flow cytometry and a 14-point cytokine map, just to ensure safety before recommending higher concentrated dosages of DHEA, due to the fact that it can drive a heightened interleukin 12 activity. But in instances of Th2 dominance, this is actually quite warranted. This is also this is one of the contributions as to why the FDA is currently in the process of recognizing a DHEA as a treatment for lupus. So interleukin 12 production drives natural killer cell activity. Interleukin 12 promotes interferon gamma secretion by natural killer cells, enhancing the cytotoxic function and counteracting Th2 dominance. The outcome, increased natural killer cell activity, aids in clearing intracellular pathogens, reducing the prolonged inflammatory state driven by Th2 cytokines, and mitigating excessive neutrophil recruitment. Yet another shout out to Neogenesis Health. They make a great Apigen product coupled with their monolaurin, both of which aid the reduction of viral elements from disrupting the mucosa, and in so doing altering the pH of the environment, which can afford reoccurring overgrowth of variables such as candiasis. It's important to remember that microorganisms very rarely operate in isolation. So if there is some kind of covert viral activity, often it can actually induce an environment that can promote fungal overgrowth, as in this example. So monolaurin and Apigen really work really well in order to reduce the likelihood thereof. So if those, and they also help to improve, both monolaurin in particular help to improve interleukin 12 function, not by aggressively promoting its expression, but more so by modulating its activity by way and how it improves recognition of the immune system to viral elements. So it's a gentler way to do something very similar as to what high dose DHEA may do, albeit not as aggressive, but that may be warranted and very welcome in many an instance. DHEA also modulates interleukin 6. This is also a reason as to why it has been seen to support those with metabolic resistance associated weight loss resistance. Interleukin 6, as mentioned before, in a situation of heightened Th2 dominance, can drive Th17 responses, which most certainly leads to an increase of fibrotic outcome. So in instances of insulin resistance, as an example, interleukin 6 levels are generally higher, and that's what DHEA aids to downregulate, and in so doing can actually improve upon metabolic sensitivity. In reducing interleukin 6 levels by suppressing nuclear factor kappa beta activation, a transcription factor central to interleukin 6 expression. So basically, it suppresses heightened nuclear factor kappa beta mediated interleukin 6 expression. This anti-inflammatory effect reduces interleukin-induced neutrophil activation and recruitment, again, when I mentioned with the Th17 associated response. The outcome is lowered interleukin 6 levels, alleviate the chronic inflammatory loop, and reduce neutrophil-mediated tissue damage associated in extreme conditions such as Th17 dominant autoimmunity, associated autoimmunity. Balance the impact in Th2 dominance by enhancing Th1-associated immune responses via natural killer cell increase and suppressing pro-inflammatory interleukin 6. DHEA shifts immune balance from Th2 dominance toward more regulated states, reducing unnecessary neutrophil activation. However, This also needs to be taken under consideration with certain methylation genome and certain salt genome, just amongst many other genes that are associated with estrogen metabolism. Those who have more of a sluggish estrogen metabolism need to err caution in dosing or high dosages of DHEA if it is that they are exhibiting a Th2 immunological dominant state. Estrogen is an amazing hormone. It's probably one of the strongest hormones to mitigate neurodegenerative outcomes by way and how it modulates glycan expression in the central nervous system. It also supports HDL formation more so than any other of the sex hormones. So it has its place, but it also has the greatest potential to stimulate polymorphic nuclear responsive histamine release, especially if there is poor competition to its rise in the body. So DHEA can convert to androgens and subsequently to estrogens via aromatase activity. So aromatase, is dependent upon the fat percentile or the quantity of fat availability, but also the metabolic activity of that fat. So aromatase isn't all bad. T3 actually potentiates aromatase activity, in which in a female's body is warranted, particularly if a female is experiencing low estrogen productive capacity, such as in instances of polycystic ovary syndrome. That's where T3 can actually potentiate the conversion of an excess of an androgen dominant environment, such as in PCOS, to a more estrogen neutral environment, and thus supporting the reduction of PCOS progression. However, in contrast to that, an excess of aromatase activity can also drive the reduction of free testosterone, which leaves estrogen unopposed, which can worsen Th2 immunological expression. So it's very much contextual within the entire endocrine view of what's going on between the difference of sex hormones and their activities, as well as from a genetic perspective as to how well a person metabolizes these hormones. Whether or not DHEA can be beneficial or detrimental in certain instances. This can further elevate active estrogen levels, worsening symptoms of estrogen dominance, such as impaired thyroid hormone signaling and mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is really important to take note because heightened estrogen does not only potentiate polymorphic nuclear leukocytes release of histamine, but it also increases thyroid binding globulin. So an increase of estrogen levels elevate thyroid binding globulin, reducing free T3 availability. Estrogen dominance also increases oxidative stress, impairing mitochondrial function and T3 receptor sensitivity. So this is also contextual because so it's not all bad. Thyroid binding globulin is the necessary brakes to thyroid activity. So we do need estrogen in order to ensure our brakes are working when we're trying to get into the Ferrari of T3 activity. However, if the brakes are so strong and what we think is a Ferrari is actually a Volkswagen, then we're not really going to go very far with our metabolic throughput with heightened TGB in a situation of poor T3 efficacy or availability. Again, in individuals with slow estrogen metabolizing genotypes, DHEA supplementation may worsen estrogen dominance by increasing estrogen levels and impairing thyroid mitochondrial receptivity, supporting methylation, enhancing detoxification pathways, and modulating aromatase activity are critical to mitigating these risks and restoring hormone balance. I just want to emphasize modulating aromatase. Aromatase is not our enemy, and quite on the contrary, it is very supportive in many instances, even in the production of certain protein drivers to aid insulin regulation and sensitivity. But again, it is about the quantity of its activity and its expression that would dictate whether or not it is counterproductive or productive in our total cellular metabolomics. Semaglutide, so it's, GLPs become all the rage. I think everybody and their aunt and uncle are talking about semaglutide, whether it's Ozempic or we say GLPs, whether it is semaglutide Ozempic or tirzepatide Mounjaro or retatrutide. And apparently there's a new one coming out with 4 peptides combined within its construct. Can't recall its name. So whatever it might be, it does have its place. However, it does also err massive amounts of caution. There is most certainly what I've seen an increase of calcium turnover in the use of semaglutide, which can be beneficial if it is that there is healthy androgen signaling and healthy growth hormone availability. But in instances where there might be poor growth hormone throughput, leading to insufficient balance between GH and IGF-1 activity, as well as insufficient androgen receptor sensitivity and uptake, the increased drive of that calcium throughput from semaglutide can most certainly lead to a overly excited nervous system, of which many a person has been utilizing these substances or these interventions, shall we call them, have approached me and said that their sleep had become quite compromised in their use. It's not uncommon in those using different GLPs, especially the higher dosages, to note compromised deep wave sleep patterns. Paradoxically, depending upon the dose, certain individuals actually notice initially an improvement because of that same mechanism as to how it alters parathyroid activity in calcium turnover or calcium utility in the body. So the point to consider in the use of any of these GLPs or GIPs or glucagon, GIP, GLPs is in the activity of androgen receptors as well as growth hormone output. In my opinion, if those systems are not in good regulation, one should really first address those systems before it is you put this weight loss silver bullet into the equation. That being said, in instances such as polycystic ovary syndrome, it can be a game changer in how it actually mediates or mitigates certain dominance that may come about by way of poor estrogen receptor sensitivity or androgen dominant state. And how it goes about doing so, I postulate, because there's still more research out there that hasn't quite confirmed it as such, but I do postulate that it does increase, well, we do know that semaglutide or increases sex hormone binding globulin, which in doing so actually improves upon GLUT4 protein production, which helps insulin trafficking. But in doing so, it can also reduce the availability of androgens or free testosterone, as well as impacting that ratio to estradiol, within which a scenario such as PCOS could actually afford a balanced, a more balanced endocrine metabolomic situation. However, it is also contextual of time and review, continual review of diagnostics to determine whether or not that critical threshold has been achieved, at which point it may be causing a unwanted outcome such as bone mineral density loss. So point is that it is a powerful molecule, but your thyroid needs to be working effectively. Your androgen receptors and your growth hormone receptors, and your entire sex hormone endocrine function should be in a place of receiving its signal prior to amplifying its weight loss effect. Else, you might have temporary gain for long-term pain that can come about by way of worsened bone mineral density and other variables. However, with regards to this presentation, it does show effect by reducing thyroid binding globulin, and how it does so is actually by way in which, through its effect in increasing sex hormone binding globulin, can actually reduce estrogen's capacity to increase TBG output. Semaglutide's role improves hepatic function, so it also reduces steatosis, fatty liver, which potentially lowers thyroid binding globulin overproduction driven by estrogen. To that point, it's also interesting when we look into its impact on thyroid hormone receptors in the liver. And it's contextual here again, in that it can momentarily improve upon their functionality by way and how it addresses steatosis. However, if that signal is exacerbated in an instance whereby there is poor mitochondrial thyroid signaling occurrence due to, as an example, microvasculature congestion, that signal may lead to a bottleneck. And that bottleneck may actually, paradoxically, actually somewhat reduce the activity of THR beta in the liver. So again, it's contextual of the entire scenario and also the length of use, which one should always have periodic check-ins, as if they're going to be utilizing any intervention, including that of weight loss agents such as semaglutide. It does improve upon insulin sensitivity, but how it does so is by regulating the beta cells' release of insulin more efficiently around prandial effect, which again, initially can show great outcome of weight loss, but as its effect on reducing appetite can become more and more pronounced, in particular due to its dual effect in increasing calcium signaling by heightening parathyroid activity. This can also lead to a somewhat of a stress response. And paradoxically, if that stress response is prolonged, i.e. the GLP or GIP is used for longer than it ought to be used, this, by way and how it induces a sympathetic state, can actually paradoxically reduce insulin receptor sensitivity. And I have seen this on 2 occasions whereby initially HOMA indexes improved, but because the therapy was prolonged, certain HOMA indexes actually showed, particularly beta cell specific, actually showed a worsened outcome in its prolonged use. So most certainly it can help instances of estrogen-associated Th2 immunological dominance, but its duration is contextual and does require ongoing vigilance into the diagnostic outcomes. From an immune modulator perspective, GLP-1 receptor activation reduces chronic low-grade inflammation by decreasing interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha levels, shifting immune responses away from Th2 dominance and restoring balance. Solution to estrogen dominance induced Th2 dominance, restore thyroid hormone availability, and again, it's contextual in its duration of use, as well as the status of the microvasculature. By lowering thyroid binding globulin production, semaglutide may increase free T3 levels. But it's not just about the availability of T3, it's also about the way in which it can be delivered to its target receptors. And that's something really important to take into consideration when factoring in the consideration in the use of semaglutide to improve upon T3 utility on a cellular construct. Nonetheless, to continue with the sentence, improving mitochondrial function and energy metabolism essential for immune homeostasis in context that the delivery of the hormone is reaching its target receptor efficiently. Reduce Th2 dominance, enhance mitochondrial efficiency, and reduce inflammation through GLP-1 receptor activation, create a more balanced Th1, Th2 immune profile, mitigating the effects of estrogen dominance. Probably, possibly, not under certainty. Again, enhanced mitochondrial efficiency. This is reiterating what I mentioned there before. Does semaglutide increase the risk of pancreatic cancer? So there was a lot of scare mongering a while back, and actually came about by extrapolation from papers that researched the use of GLP-1s on mice, rodents at the time. And we need to really take into consideration that animal studies are not always directly transferable into the human physiology. Human studies, however, from what I've seen, haven't indicated any causal effect. There was a cohort of 543,595 type 2 diabetes patients, found no significant increase in pancreatic cancer risk amongst GLP-1 users over a 7-year period. So it's quite a long, period of a retrospective, a cohort study, sorry, not retrospective analysis. In another study as well, meta-analysis of random trials found no significant association between GLP-1 use and pancreatic cancer risk either. So in human trials, there isn't anything concrete to indicate the risk of cancer. However, that doesn't mean that we should not continue to keep an eye, because the pleiotropic nature of GLP-1, which is produced by our own enteroendocrine cells, it can have wide-reaching effect onto other variables of metabolism, particularly immunometabolism. So still keeping an eye on that. However, when it came to what it was that media was portraying in its increased risk of pancreatic cancer, they extrapolated those findings from rodent studies. Okay, so the reason, but why exactly? What is the difference? Well, key findings from animal studies: pancreatic hyperplasia, inflammation. So this is from rodent studies. Activation of GLP-1 receptors in rodents increased cyclic adenosine monophosphate levels in pancreatic tissues, leading to cellular proliferation and potential tumor formation, raising safety concerns. Pancreatic changes in rodents cause ductal proliferation inflammation, which may predispose to tumor development through these effects, although these effects have not been consistently observed in humans. Okay, so they haven't been observed in humans at all, actually. Well, not carcinogenic effects, at least. So why is it? So findings from animal studies: pancreatic hyperplasia inflammation. GLP-1 receptor agonists cause pancreatic duct cell proliferation and mild inflammation in animals, raising concerns. Rodents treated with GLP-1 increased pancreatic mass due to cell proliferation. GLP receptors in pancreatic tissue, prolonged receptor activation in rodents influence pancreatic morphology. Okay, but why? Rodents have higher GLP-1 receptor density than that of humans. So it's an entire different physiological construct. In comparison to rodents, humans have a fraction in the density of GLP-1 receptors in the pancreas, which is also a reason as to why the use of high drug doses make them more prone to receptor-mediated effects and toxicity than humans. So it's not a transferable no, animal studies, once again, are not directly transferable to human physiology. They are considered as means of caution, but their transferability in this instance, at least at this time point when this research was done, is not direct. Okay, so although it isn't direct, it doesn't mean that cautions should not still continue to take place. Undoubtedly, if there is warranted carcinogenic or oncogenetic outcome in animal trials, keeping an eye on not only the pancreatic mass that occurred, but the variables and mechanisms in the pathophysiology that took place in rodents that led to that, apart from just the receptor makeup or density, needs ongoing research to continue to validate the safety assurity in the use of any substance, not just that of GLP-1s. Melatonin is our next intervention to discuss here. Melatonin depends upon the quantity of intake, interestingly enough. A high quantity intake of melatonin can suppress Th2-driven cytokines. A lower can actually potentiate those cytokines. So it really depends upon the quantity of intake. But nonetheless, melatonin suppresses Th2-driven cytokines such as interleukin-4 and interleukin-13 by modulating transcription factors like nuclear factor kappa beta, which are pivotal in pro-inflammatory and Th2-skewed responses. An impact, this reduces an overactive Th2 profile, allowing for a shift toward a more balanced Th1, Th2 immune response. The mechanism as to how it does so in the mitochondrial restoration: melatonin directly scavenges reactive oxygen species and enhances the activity of mitochondrial antioxidant enzymes such as superoxide dismutase and glutathione peroxidase. This restores mitochondrial function and reduces oxidative stress, which are crucial in resolving chronic Th2-mediated inflammation. The impact of that improved mitochondrial activity supports immune cells like natural killer cells and macrophage, which are often suppressed in Th2-dominant states. What I love about melatonin is that it actually supports pyruvate dehydrogenase and inhibits pyruvate kinase activity, which potentiates the electron transport chain's efficiency. And in so doing, that in its own right would actually deter an extracellular variable of stress by way of heightened free radical exposure due to poor oxidative phosphorylated mechanisms. So it is a very powerful antioxidant for the mitochondria. And in that, I believe, is where it serves a lot of its immune modulative effect on different T helper cell responses. Regulation of T cells, Tregs, melatonin enhances differentiation and function of Tregs, which are crucial for maintaining immune tolerance. By upregulating Tregs, melatonin can suppress excessive Th2 activation and reduce autoimmunity. Again, it's contextual to the quantity. Very high dosages of melatonin can actually induce a radical Th1 response, which is also a reason as to why dosages above 200 milligrams and more are used in certain tumor cell cancer states, because that increase, and in that, there is obviously a reduction in its effect on Tregs in a particular scenario. So it's contextual to the dose and also the environment in which it is utilized, but extremely high doses of melatonin can most certainly improve upon Th1 mediated cytotoxic outcomes, particularly in cancer patients. An impact, however, in Treg activity helps to suppress overactive Th2 responses and promotes a balanced immune environment. And it's more so the inducible Tregs than the natural Tregs that melatonin increases the output of. A modulation of circadian rhythms and immune regulation. Melatonin regulates circadian rhythms, which are closely tied to immune function. Basically, the better that we have our sleep cycle synchronized with the sun-moon cycle, or the dawn to dusk effect, will impact how our immune systems respond to the requirement of energy output or energy restoration. The impact of that is a well-regulated circadian system reduces likelihood of chronic inflammation and Th2 skewing. Melatonin can also inhibit interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, which is quite interesting because it can potentiate Th1 outcomes, but actually reduce the inflammatory effect of interleukin-6 in its improving upon interleukin-12 activity. So in that, melatonin downregulates interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor, both of which are key mediators that contribute towards Th2 dominance. It creates lower levels of these cytokines, creating systemic inflammation, allowing for better immune balance. So it can actually improve the efficiency of Th1 without inducing hyper-inflammatory outcomes in its cytotoxic efficiency, which I think is quite cool as to what melatonin does. And that's the end of today's segment for Th2 immunological dominance. I do appreciate all you guys sharing your time, effort, and energy to watch in or view in on today's segment. I will be sharing this segment on YouTube shortly for those who weren't able to make it. And again, thank you very much for your time today, and looking forward to our next segment, which will be segment 7, in which I discuss the diagnostic validity to determining Th2 dominance, immunological dominance. In particular, we will be discussing the lymphocyte flow cytometry and Dr. Patterson from Radiance Diagnostics 14-point cytokine map. For me, Justin McGuire, I hope you guys have a good week further. Until we meet again next time, remember,